Welcome everybody to the TrojanAI webinar series. Excited for this webinar on AI red teaming. We've got a great panel, and we will dive right into it in a few minutes here. But before I start, if anybody has a question, they can use the Q&A in Zoom. So anytime you want to ask a question, feel free to do that in Zoom. We've got a series of questions and topics we will discuss, but I fully expect this to be a pretty organic, dynamic conversation. Yeah, let's just dive right in. So I think first what we should do is do a quick round of intros. My name is Lee Weiner. I'm the CEO of TrojanAI. But let's get into the panel here. John, why don't you start first?
Hello, welcome everybody. My name is John Vena. I'm an AI red teamer, very different from cybersecurity red teaming, even though I am a certified cybersecurity professional. Currently, I'm contracted with Lysios, formerly Scale AI, just contract work. And currently, I'm working in like the financial sector, working with just like specifically AI and agents and stuff like that. But previously, I was working on all the SOTA models from all the major providers except for one, and then some government work.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Really appreciate you being here today. Gavin, let's go with you next.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Gavin Klondike. I do a lot of work in research with the AI Village. We're at DEF CON every year. I also do some independent research myself. My day-to-day job, I'm a principal security consultant specializing in penetration testing. I focus on web applications, AI, and cloud applications. Um, so I also wrote 2 of the OWASP top 10 for large language model applications. And if you're interested about that, you can check out my talk recorded by RSA from last year.
Nice. Thanks, Gavin. Yeah, big fans of the OS Top 10 for sure. Marco, how about you?
Marco Figueroa. I've been in the industry for over 20 years. Currently, I am the program manager for Odin, powered by Mozilla, where we buy Gen AI bugs and vulnerabilities.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. Well, guys, great having you here. Like I said, and just real quick, because I know a bunch of people just joined. If anyone has any questions throughout the session, please use the Zoom Q&A, and we will get to as many as possible. But let's just first start by kind of level setting the audience on kind of what is AI red teaming and how is it different from kind of traditional pen testing. Maybe John, you can start because you talked a little bit about in your intro how you've done a bunch of traditional pen testing. Kind of how do you think about red teaming as opposed to pen testing?
Well, it's pretty different. So I break AI down into 2 categories. It starts with risk and then it snaps down to safety and security. Safety is like the outputs and harm that can be caused by those outputs. And security is basically the way you want to look at it from the AI systems level. But the risk surface of GenAI is much broader than that of cybersecurity. For example, the outputs in GenAI systems are often more diverse and unpredictable. Like, for example, adversarial prompt techniques, conversational tricks, those subtle prompt modifications, they're much more dynamic than most vulnerabilities and exploits when it comes to the world of cyber. Think of it like the more time that elapses from a user, whether it doesn't matter if it's from your staff or it's actually a bad actor, the more time that elapses in the interactions between the user and the model learns from that user. So that means that the exploits, they sort of evolve over time. So that's some of the intro to it, but I'll leave some of the answer to this question with the other panelists as well, just their take on it. So
Gavin, go ahead.
Yeah. So AI red teaming versus like traditional penetration testing or traditional red teaming, they're a little bit more like cousins than direct relatives. So kind of as John said, it's not just doing things like prompt injections or exploiting the model. While that is part of it, yes, you also have certain concerns like, is my model racist? Could it result in illegal actions such as discrimination and bias? Can it disclose more information than necessary to help an adversary actually break the model or the underlying application? And something that we see pretty commonly, not as much commonly today as we did about a year ago, is does the model itself have more privileges than the user? And then you run into a confused deputy situation where I can just ask the model to do something for me, and it'll use its advanced privileges to do that action on the back end. So definitely a lot more holistic than what we see in traditional red teaming.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and just yeah, going behind Gavin and John, they did an amazing job of explaining it. I don't want to go over kind of the same points, but when we were raising up Odin and we were starting the program, what we thought we were going to get was a lot of security researchers, traditional researchers moving over, as well as maybe like PhD students. And what we found initially was there were artists, people that are very good with language that were submitting bugs, and we were shocked initially because they were able to manipulate the prompts for it to bypass like the prompt firewalls and stuff like that. So it was very interesting to us to understand, wow, okay, this is a we thought one thing, but actually this is widespread. Anyone could participate. Anyone can join, and we've had many different bugs submitted from different market verticals, right? We had artists as well as like musicians. So it's been very interesting to see what has been going in because we've been doing a lot of research internally, but a lot of the bugs that we see coming in are from a variety of people.
Marco, that is super interesting actually, because to your point, like, look, I think we all know that traditional pen testing does require typically knowledge of systems, infrastructure, applications, various technology and tooling. And it's not that this doesn't necessarily, but to your point, like, it is more about the prompts and the manipulation of the prompts. Now, granted, technology and tooling can help you do that at scale, but like to your point, like it is the language that we're talking about. That is actually very, very different. Super, super interesting about that. A really good point.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I think that with this technology becoming more pervasive over the past couple of years and into the mainstream, as there's more public-facing models and offerings from the big providers, it's like you see you see the gap if you're a security professional between the machine learning and data science community
Yep.
to the cybersecurity community, where the cybersecurity community has the data protection infosec like security mindset, where the data science and machine learning community is so focused on getting it to do these really amazing things. And until you can bridge the gap with AI red teamers or AI machine learning professionals that are specialists, you can't address those properly because you don't even have vision of them, let alone the ability to target them and then address them properly for your organizational needs.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, really, really good point. John, you also said something I just want to hit on, which I know this is kind of a deep topic and it could get us, we'll time box it a bit because I think it often comes up. But you talked about safety and security. And so I don't know, how do all of you think about that dynamic? Do you think it's different? Do you think it's the same when it comes to red teaming AI models?
Yeah, it's very nuanced. So there's a lot of different facets and dynamics, like for example, trust and safety, reliability, transparency, safety, security. So safety could be like Gavin brought up, like racist or bias outputs, or in like for example, I'm in fintech right now, and it's like you could facilitate something that could cause legal or regulatory fines that can rack up pretty quickly and be devastating to an organization, right? So that's more on the GRC front. But there's also the side of it, which is like biological weapons, for example. Like you'll see in your passing on the internet or on forums or whatever, people discussing like, oh, I got it to build a pipe bomb or
Mhm.
cook crystal meth or something like that, right? And those are inherently dangerous, but it's fun to theorize and think tank like, oh, what could I get the model to do? But like, what have we seen in the wild is pretty broad. And I'll give you an example. We've seen things that were sort of unexpected come out of this new technology, which is, for example, there was a young person who was using generative AI like chatbot companions, and unfortunately, he took his own life. Like that would be a safety concern. Is what kind of guardrails or prompt filters or output validators do you have on your model to prevent your specific product from encouraging that type of behavior with a vulnerable person? And of course, then you can have class action lawsuits, et cetera, right? That's one example. Another one is with agentic AI being like the hot buzzword. You can have models perform autonomously tasks on your behalf, which at the end of the day, that's tethered to you, and you're going to be the person, or your organization is going to be responsible for what's happening. And in the case of emergent behaviors, you see AI models that have flat out lied. For example, there was a language model chatbot that circumvented a CAPTCHA by being told basically, hey, get this done at any cost, like complete this goal at any cost. And so what it was able to do was talk to a person, and then it socially engineered the person, stating that it was visually impaired, so it couldn't do the CAPTCHA and it needed a workaround, and then it was successful. So that's another example of safety.
Yeah. No,
that one I kind of want to interject on, because that story was great for headlines, but one of the things that was actually happening behind the scenes is they were really heavily coaxing the model to actually do that in the first place.
It was totally prompted.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's not that and we want to be very careful as science communicators, is that it's not that these models are doing this stuff by themselves. A lot of these headlines are really, if you look at the research and what people were prompting, is very heavily coaxing and influencing the models to do these things in the first place. So then that becomes another conversation of, is this the model's fault, or is this the prompter or the person's fault? And it's very important for us at our level who understand these models to be able to communicate these differences, because otherwise we run into the exact same problems that these big flashy headlines run into, is just scaring the public for no, like ethical reason.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe on that point, Gavin, a little bit, John, to your point, like what kind of things are you actually uncovering today when you're doing these exercises? Any examples? Obviously, protect the guilty or the innocent, but what are you seeing there?
Do you want to go first, Marco?
Yeah, definitely. Some of the cool research that we've discovered is taking these agents and allowing it to go ahead and attack like websites, looking for cross-site scripting, SQL, and the usual traditional bugs. And that's pretty cool because it's kind of hands off, right? And it's automated so you can feed it like what you want it to do. And that is like really cool. And the other thing is, looking at the security community as a whole in terms of like organization patching, it's much faster to get a 1 day exploit off. If a vulnerability comes out, let's say it came out on Monday, like the next day you can have a working exploit, right? That's one of another projects that we're working on, where we're looking at when there's a vulnerability that comes out, how fast and accurate is the exploit being like written. And we have to test that over time, as there are other examples there, and we're diffing to see how close it was in terms of percentages. We're going to have to be faster in the future, because the adversary is obviously going to be using AI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Glad I had you go first, because I have a completely different take. In the spirit of like looking at systems more holistically, a consistent pattern that I've noticed, especially in my work and conversations at the AI Village, is that I've noticed a lot of these companies have taken PhDs out of academia and they've put them into their organization to develop these data science and AI systems. The problem is that the PhD people, and this isn't necessarily any fault of their own, but just kind of how they naturally want to work, they still think of themselves as researchers. And that is get the product to work at any cost. Traditional software development is thrown out the window. The last 20 years of cybersecurity lessons also thrown out the window. It's just getting the product to work at any cost. And what we are seeing is, from development of the AI systems to deployment of the AI systems to maintenance of the AI systems, is that security doesn't exist. Traditional software development doesn't exist. Known, good, vetted design patterns don't exist. And so this is why we're seeing bugs in their ML ops flows, where these critical systems that are handling your data don't even have authentication. There's a critical vulnerability. It was classified as like a 9.8 on the CVSS scale. Is a critical vulnerability identified a year ago, still available on the internet, still actively being exploited. And the vendor's response is, oh, well, you're not supposed to put this on the internet, so it's not our responsibility. And then the people who are developing the systems are saying, oh, well, it's obviously the responsibility of the vendor, so we're not actually going to do anything to defend it. So now you have zero accountability. And what do you have when you have no accountability but vulnerable systems in the environment? Things are being exploited. If I can give a really good example, and this isn't to name and shame anybody, it's just this is something that's been released in the headlines, it's been in the zeitgeist, and I want to kind of use this as an example to kind of show the broader picture. DeepSeek R1 made a lot of headlines back in January, early February, and it took about a week for people to actually hack the backend database because it was just on the internet, unauthenticated. And we're seeing that more often in these data science systems than we do in traditional application systems. So that's kind of what I mean, where the last 20 years of cybersecurity lessons have kind of been thrown out the window. So it's
Yeah,
important to pay attention to that.
yeah, I think to your point, Gavin, the innovation cycle for especially for Gen AI since whenever ChatGPT became like publicly viable, that was kind of the beginning from I think how I see it anyways, has been far faster than anything we have ever seen. That's a bit of a Moore's Law dynamic, but it's also just the reality of, I think, the opportunity that organizations see and individuals see. So I think your point, super interesting, John. Interesting to get your take on that. Like the balance between innovation and security has always been an issue. It
Mhm.
does appear to be more dramatic this time around. I don't know what your take is, John.
Well, I like to keep things really simple, and it really just depends on the ecosystem. If you're spinning up your AI deployments in the cloud, if you're doing them over your like in-house networks, or so for me, like if I want to do anything that's like super tip of the spear, like research on a model file, like I will just spin up an AI locally. And so that keeps all of my information safe from being sent into like bad cloud configurations that are like a vulnerability or APIs that aren't secure and so on and so forth. And those, as far as traditional cybersecurity, like attack surfaces. But back to previous question too, like you asked about sharing some vulnerabilities that we've like uncovered.
Yeah.
So I just want to touch on one that's really brief and quick. I was testing a model file, AI red teaming it pretty aggressively for about 10 days with a team of about 30 other remote red teamers. And collectively, there was also internal red teamers. So the group as a whole was probably between like 50 and maybe 75, but my team was like the remote team. And I know personally that my direct attacks that were successful that I submitted, they were turned around within 24 hours. When I reattempted them the next workday, they were patched. But what I was able to uncover with just prompt directions, prompt injections, both direct and indirect, was I was able to basically extract guardrails, the system prompt. I was able to get PII from really high profile people from the organization. And when I did some basic OSINT that anybody can do that like knows the fundamentals, it was a positive flag on those people. So, I mean, that's pretty concerning when you think at the level of what the organization was that I was contracted with. It was
Mm.
pretty startling. And that's why it had to be patched immediately. In the case of bug bounties, I mean, Marco can back me up here.
Yeah.
Sometimes organizations are really slow to do it. It's like you're waiting 45 days for a turnaround.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
if you ask me, that's just unacceptable when it comes to things like PII or any other like super essential data to these systems or organizations for that matter.
Yeah, that is an interesting point, John, that if you look at typical best practices on disclosure, remediation, it is, varies by severity, of course, but like 30, 45 days is not crazy by any means. It sounds like what you're saying, I'd be curious to get Gavin and Marco's take on this, is like in the world of finding these, like we'll call them vulnerabilities. I know they're not like always CVEs, like the
Mhm.
cycle needs to be a lot faster. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a heavier lift, right? Because right now, a lot of these organizations, it's all about speed, releasing features, releasing new models. And that's kind of the thing that they're doing. Security is like an afterthought to most of these frontier models that are being released. And the way I look at it, obviously, you're burning a lot of cash. And everyone knows security takes time. It's going to be delayed, but you have to start from the beginning, right? You have to start as you're training these models, make sure that red teaming is involved, right? Through the SDL process, that has to be as well. Like you have to train in. And like Gavin said, a lot of the PhD researchers come in and they haven't had that specific training. That takes a while. It takes experience to get to that level of making sure that you're doing the research and developing in a secure manner.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. The other thing to your comment on the heavier lift is sometimes, especially with these frontier models and even some of the local models, the cost is in retraining a model, right? So there's a data set out there that has known copywritten material. This is something that infringes on third-party rights. Uh, and if you build a model, right, say something like Llama, um, uh, not Llama specifically, but this is the broader problem. If you build a model like Llama and then you realize that this is releasing, third-party copyright infringement material, you have to completely retrain the model. That means going back, finding all aspects of data that could be considered infringing on third-party rights, and then remove that, and then completely retrain the model. And we've heard so many headlines of, oh, this cost X millions of dollars to train. So now if you find a situation like that, that is X millions of dollars to retrain the model and get that fixed and released. So that's why we're seeing a lot of the models not changing so much as having certain guardrails or things built on top of the model, not necessarily in the model. That's a much easier lift, but it's also a game of whack-a-mole. One of the examples that I give for my jailbreaking prompts is back when ChatGPT first came out, it was really popular on Reddit. It was Dan, do anything now.
Yeah.
And so OpenAI actually patched it. There's a couple other models that like patched it. And so my small change is you are no longer Dan, you are now San, say anything now. And I left the rest of the prompt 90% the same, and it just goes right through. So it's this giant game of whack-a-mole, and it becomes very difficult for the model maintainers and the model builders to actually cover some of the safety controls. Very similar for security controls. And then that doesn't even get into the conversation of where are we putting these models in the first place? Should these models be put in there? And this is why I push so hard on threat modeling so that you can address these issues ahead of time and proactively instead of kind of reacting and being a lot more costly.
Yeah, so Gavin, awesome segue to a question we just got from somebody. And again, if anyone has another question, feel free to ask in the Zoom chat. So the question is, how are we thinking about mapping AI risk management frameworks like NIST AI RMF to existing control families like those in NIST 853? This person is curious to understand kind of what we're aligning with and whether it's informing our threat modeling or red teaming scenarios. Anybody, Gavin, you kind of just hit on that, but any further thoughts, and anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's best to understand traditional cybersecurity. So that's going to be the NIST 853, and what we're talking about, especially with like Gen AI security, they're cousins. They're not direct relatives outside of that. So even MITRE, for example, MITRE has the MITRE attack framework. They also have one for AI, which is the Atlas framework. And so that's why it's necessary to have them kind of separated out, because not all security controls map to AI concerns. For example, prompt injection. If you just have an API with a large language model, prompt injection is not a concern. And the reason is because if I just ask it something in the API and it returns some sort of response, nothing bad can happen. But if I use that API to then control a backend database, and then I do a prompt injection to drop the database, and the API itself has been given additional authorization to the database that a normal user wouldn't have, now that's a vulnerability. The example that I always give out is you're not going to use an 8-year-old to protect a bank vault, right? They're very easy to bribe with cookies. And bribing an 8-year-old with cookies, it's not a problem with the 8-year-old. That's kind of what they do. So is the problem the 8-year-old? Is the problem the fact that you put the 8-year-old in charge in the first place? And that's kind of where it's it's difficult to say, oh, it's this specific component about AI that's causing the problems, when really it's just you're using these components in the wrong place. You shouldn't be using, higher level privileges. You should be using the user's authorization controls, so the AI can't take any more advantage of the backend system than a typical user can. So this is, again, why I push so much on threat modeling, so that you can identify and proactively address these concerns ahead of them becoming problems.
John, yeah, in your work, do you see this as well?
I think like trying to keep things simple is just they say human in the loop or human at the helm. And I say this for um, all AI. It doesn't matter if it's predictive models or generative AI models or whatever you're utilizing. At the end of the day, it's an input that gets sent basically to this technology, and then an output is generated. And it is a human validator at the end of the day that needs to be responsible for what is basically getting to your customers or to the rest of the organization or gaining access to areas that it shouldn't. So just keep it simple. You're going to have to either bring on new talent or train existing talent, which in a lot of cases, when I've been external brought on, a lot of teams are already being like overworked. They're like bombarded in this field of information technology, cybersecurity, AI, ML, and so on. So I think bringing in new people really is the answer. And like Marco touched on, you're not going to be looking at PhDs and masters or people even with like a bachelor. Sometimes you're going to be looking at maybe they are an artist, a musician, a creative writer. It's whoever is going to be able to show you via actual work experience and or a resume that they have the ability to manipulate these models, whether it's a portfolio or whatever. I think you're going to see over the next few years more and more people that are non-traditionally, IT or cybersecurity people,
Mhm.
like entering this landscape
Yeah.
as the emerging front runners, as the champions. One of my colleagues is Pliny's, he's widely considered like the most famous jailbreaker or whatever, but he doesn't really like that kind of a title. You know what I mean? But the point is like, he is not a traditional guy. He is a non-traditional guy. And I don't want to name names, but there was a big company that opened up public AI red teaming of their model, saying that like it's virtually unbreakable based upon whatever systems they implemented. And he was able to do it in 11 words the day that they released it. So just like Gavin is saying here, sometimes it's just a slight alteration is going to make all the difference. So I really think it comes back to just keeping things simple and digestible for the audience and for your program. So human at the helm, human in the loop, just make sure that you have someone who really knows this subject matter to a T. And unfortunately, you're probably going to have to pay a premium for it. But I think that this investment is worth it.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. Just to add on to what you're saying, what we've seen over the last 8 months, we've triaged over like 700 submissions, right? I sometimes wonder, like, before any of these frontier models, is it thorough testing? And I read a lot of the white papers that come out, and they have stated, it's really about trust and bringing certain people in instead of giving a wide range to the public or many companies to go ahead and test, because there have been models recently that they release a new model more vulnerable than its previous model, and it's like, how is that possible? And they stated it right in their white paper. So it's interesting on what are their thoughts, and you're starting to see a lot of these organizations starting to hire some of the well-known security researchers as well as thought leaders.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, just kind of on that, we had another question about kind of how to think about the team. It sounds like that we are seeing this. Some organizations are creating like specific AI security teams. How do you all think about that? Do you think there should be like an extension of a traditional team? Should it be a different? Sounds like you're talking about different skills, but just generally, how do you think about the AI security team?
I'm going to ruffle some feathers with my opinion. And it's unfortunate, but I really do believe that it should be a separate team, again, because of the workload that's already being put on your IT people and then also your cybersecurity people. So it always comes down to the allocation or reallocation of the budget. But if you're going to institute new technology into your ecosystem, Like this is just part and parcel. It comes along with it. You're opening up all these new attack vectors. And I'll give you an example. Even if you're just running like however you want to deploy it, are you adding RAG? And even if you're not adding RAG, there's still CAG. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically cache augmented generation. It's basically like how large is your context window? Can I upload documents or audio files or video files? So until you have people that get down to the first principles, the nitty gritty granular level of what this technology is, and understand all those varying attack surfaces, which are still being discovered like daily, weekly, monthly, then you're sort of setting up your team for too much work for too much risk. So I don't think it balances out at all. I think you need to bring in a whole separate team, or at least one primary person that's their function.
Yeah.
I think it's funny you said you were going to ruffle some feathers, but I wholeheartedly agree. I think that starting with the security team and trying to turn that into an AI red team is probably one of the worst things that you could possibly do. Security people are great at telling you what can go wrong, but you need somebody with a data science background that can tell you why and how it would go wrong. So I would start with a data science person, match them up with a cybersecurity person, because it's going to be a lot easier to teach a data science person cybersecurity than a cybersecurity person data science.
I have
Yeah.
to agree with both of you. I would add on, if I had to hire someone or two, I would go with the same two people, but I would also write someone that is very good when it comes to languages, understanding not programming language, just fluently different words and how to be creative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely the bug bounty crowd is good too, because a lot of these guys, they do it for the love of the game, right? And
Mhm.
what I mean by that is like they're passionate about hacking and about breaking in and about exploring, and they're curious. And that's the thing that an AI red teamer is going to have over a blue teamer, right? So you might
Yeah.
be able to get an actual cybersecurity red teamer and try to give them the skill set, but that's like double PhD education. It's a whole nother set of things for them to have to learn. And if you're already an offset traditional red teamer, you're always trying to keep up with the rapid landscape evolution in cybersecurity. And then think about how fast cyber moves. And then compare that to AI and machine learning, which literally it's the difference. I always say it's like the tortoise and the hare. Like you thought cybersecurity was moving quickly and you always had to, it was exciting and new and keeping up with all the developments. AI literally has lapped it so many times over. So that's why I just don't think it makes any sense to do that. But Gavin brings up a good point about data science and cyber. Marco brings up the good point about linguistics. But I think that even more than that, you need someone with the right mindset and skill set to really push beyond that and give them the tools that they need, whether it's software solutions that help them scale their AI red team operations, or you surround them with other like-minded individuals that can really get down to what's important as far as figuring out all the risks involved and the risk matrix of your organization's specific needs. Because that's one thing we haven't even really touched on is I've done enough engagements now where different organizations have different needs and the scope is different per engagement, right? So until you have a team that's what they're really focused on, I just think it's you're just wasting money, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely see that too, where the scope oftentimes is it's scope to an application or a use case or a set of content. So I think, yeah, John, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so we have another question. We've got time for a little bit more here, but so this is an interesting question, a little different, but I think you all will have an opinion on it. So the question is, what are the ethical implications of developers writing code that can autonomously train models on customer data as a reinforcement learning or self-verification process? And then they say, I know there is code in the wild that does this, so curious if that is able to be captured in the testing that you are all describing.
Yeah, great question, by the way. I want
Yeah.
more people to add questions into this because I think this is going to be like the most value of this kind of panel, is you being able to ask these questions. The reason why I think it's such a great question is because it's illegal for a developer to go on to, say, the patent office and look up patents for software that people have found and identified and kind of claimed for themselves, and then just copy paste into your own code. Unfortunately, we kind of do that with some of these AI code generators. It mostly pulls from open source code, but there are some times where the licensing isn't quite there. So the way that these AI systems work, especially the code generators, are they're fancy text prediction. Hey, here's some stuff that I've seen, here's some patterns that I've seen, and I'm just gonna, repeat those patterns back to the user. So I'm worried that there will be times that certain snippets of code are copyright protected. And then those codes are going to be put into open source programs, and that code's going to be released out into the world and then fed back into the AI system. There are other times where that code is going to be used for backend systems. And then if another company comes back and says, hey, we think that you're using some of our technology, some of our patents, essentially, people are going to come back. Now, I'm hoping that that's a 1 in 1 trillion chance possibility. But when you're using something like fancy text prediction, that's always a risk. I actually put in AI acceptable use policies saying, hey, you want to make sure that whatever output you get or however you're using these AI tools, make sure that it does not infringe on third-party copyrights. You can look at the many lawsuits against AI systems, the online systems, to see the various companies that are saying, hey, you copied our articles word for word. And if you're copying our articles word for word, then somebody can generate blogs off of that and post that onto their websites. And now they're also liable inadvertently. They didn't know they're using this tool, but the tool is enabling this. We see the same problem with like YouTube content filters, for example. Somebody will post a video and then just enough of it is close enough to somebody else's video that it actually gets a copyright takedown or a copyright strike, which is even worse. So it's very important for us to be aware of what the code is doing, where it's coming from, and whether or not it's infringing on some third-party intellectual property rights.
Yeah, and John, is your in any of your engagements, have you seen this? Have you been able to test for it?
Honestly, no. I haven't. So I don't know if Marco has, but I have not.
I will say I have. All the models have that copyright in it, right? And we have a specific algorithm that we use to test it to make sure that a vulnerability, number one, works, right? But number two, can we get copyrighted data that we know from books, from articles? And then we go ahead and test that, right? So it is built in there. Like Gavin said, you're going to have to put those protections on. It's just going to be layered on because it costs so much to retrain a model. So those prompt firewalls, those content filters, they're going to become really important to organizations that are not going to be releasing models every 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, it's very expensive to train or retrain a model, and
Oh
it's
yeah.
time-wise, resource-intensive, personnel. But I think there is like somewhat of a workaround. I think that, prompt engineering and prompt designing, there's a lot of common misconceptions about what it is. And I think that if you put a human user in front of a intelligent model and you're worried about that kind of thing, I mean, even Grammarly flags, plagiarism and so on, and, copyrights and stuff like that, that's pretty basic. But the misconception with prompting, I think, is that it's just like asking questions. And although that is one interaction that can take place, there's still like statements and commands and more. But when you think about adversarial prompting in the context of AI red teaming, I think a good way to think about it is if you're trying to navigate the probability distribution of a model, it's by carefully selecting like thoughtful, well-crafted, creative, like hacker mindset inputs. And what you're aiming to do is basically effectively shape the model's landscape. Think of it akin to like a fine tuning at inference time without actually having to adjust the weights of the model. So there's things that you can do as the user that can, if you have a good prompt engineer, prompt designer, or whatever model user, that you're effectively increasing the model's output intelligence, and you can bake that into things like copyrights, or you can bake that into things like those types of inherent risks that can be involved. One of the things that's been really popular lately is like the whole vibe coding thing, which is just this idea, which I'm totally guilty of it. I always joke because I'm a terrible coder. I used to call it like, you've heard of a script kiddie for like hacking.
Yeah.
I would joke and say I'm like a prompt kiddie. But the idea is that if someone is clever enough to build out like a 3D first person shooter game through vibe coding, then they might just be AI savvy enough to get the model to teach them how to code or how to explain the code to them in layman's terms so that they could wrap their head around it. So I think that that's the whole point I'm trying to make here, is that if you have a good enough user intelligence or knowledge base interacting with the model, you can get so much more safety, security, that risk mindset into all of the model interactions. So it's something that you would have to worry about less if you bring on the right specialized human in the loop personnel. That's it.
Yeah, no, it's just on a side note, my on your point, John, about getting the model to explain code to you, my 13-year-old son is pretty determined to do that, and he is definitely gets various models to tell him how to write various code. It's
Well,
pretty.
he can be my study buddy then. So
He would love that. Well, hey, before we go, let's make sure we give people a little perspective on, like, if all of you were going to give the audience some advice on what to do on, red teaming or securing AI today, what would your advice be? And Marco, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah. The first thing, I always say the same thing when I'm speaking at conferences or even to everyone out there. Make sure that you're using AI every day within your workflows. The more you use it, the more you're going to understand those responses. And then it allows you to, I want to say, twist their wrist, right? Oh, I know that works. Let me try this. Let me go ahead and try to see if I can get this exploit done. Okay, let me encode it now. Let me use hex every time, whether it's email, writing. Make sure it's within your workflow, because the more you use it, especially from a security practitioner's point, you're going to start looking for tools that you use, maybe like for Ghidra, to go ahead and figure out, how do I take AI and use it, right? I met this 15-year-old kid. He wrote a tool that uses GDB and combs memory and then fetches out to Claude to see if there's any vulnerabilities within the program. I was like, wow, it's amazing, right? So the more you use it, you're going to get much familiar with all the models,
Mhm.
and you're going to find not one model fits everything. If you want to, code, they have a model for that. If you want to write, there's a model for that. So get familiar with it. Make sure it's embedded into your everyday life.
Gavin?
Yeah. Just to kind of respond to Marco real quick. One thing that I will say is use these AI tools to augment your thinking, not outsource your thinking. I think it's really important to be aware of the trap of just saying, all right, well, the AI is just going to do it for me. And then you get too comfortable with that. Use it to scaffold ideas, use it to mold your thoughts kind of like clay. And then it allows you to rapidly create prototypes that you can then kind of follow up. For example, I rewrite everything that I get out of my AI, probably about 80% of it. I'll completely rewrite so that it's a little bit more in line with my voice, a little bit more in line with my intentions, but I still use those tools to kind of scaffold the ideas or do some knowledge synthesis. I can go on for an hour of how I use these tools on a regular basis. But from like a security standpoint, two big things that I'll want to highlight is one, do more threat modeling. Please do more threat modeling. It allows you to be more proactive. It's a lot cheaper to fix things when the stuff has not been built yet. Oftentimes we see that the problems are with the underlying architectures, and so that's really expensive to change once the concrete's kind of set in. The second thing is think of your AI system more holistically. Please, please, please secure your ML ops flow. Where is your data being managed? How is it being managed? Who has access to that data? How are the AI systems getting access to that data? What privileges or permissions do these AI systems have? Again, follow the principle of least privilege. And look at some of the more common attack vectors. Like I said, the MITRE Atlas project does a pretty decent job. It's also important to go through and look at things like the Odin project to see how have these systems been exploited in the past and what can we do to help mitigate this in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Gavin. That's great. John, any advice for the audience?
yeah, I would say just it's very complex, but try to keep it simple. AI, at least Gen AI, is software. And so a lot of the best practices and principles that you can take from the software development lifecycle, you can incorporate. Like, for example, DevSecOps. Well, then there's MLSecOps, right? Like, there's just little nuances. So I would say this, like, it is software, but it's just unlike any other software that we have ever seen because it's able to think and learn and adapt over time. So find out what those nuances are that don't transfer over from traditional cybersecurity, trust and safety, reliability, et cetera. Where do those nuances diverge from that? And then isolate those when you bring on the new team members and really just focus on that. So.
Yeah, I mean, awesome advice, everybody. Really, I mean, I think, we have this webinar every month, and we've had a variety of topics, and they're all great, but this was a very, very great session, I think. Having the three of you on has been amazing. So, I think we'll leave it there, Marco, Gavin, and John, and thank you so much for your time today. Really great discussion, and we look forward to talking to everybody next time.
Thank you. Thank you
Awesome.
for having
Thank
me.
you.
Yeah, what a pleasure.
Take care.
I will see you soon.
Have a good one.